So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. This is the Hydrology and Atmospheric Sciences Colloquium, and this year the department has partnered with the Indigenous Resilience Center and the NSF NRT, Indigenous Food, Energy, and Water Security and Sovereignty, to offer the Native Voices in STEM seminar series. I'd like to begin by providing the land acknowledgement. At University of Arizona, we respectfully acknowledge that we are on the land and territories of Indigenous peoples. Today, Arizona is home to 22 federally recognized tribes, with Tucson being home to the O'odham and the Yaqui. Committed to diversity and inclusion, the university strives to build sustainable relationships with sovereign Native nations and Indigenous communities through education offerings, partnerships, and community service. The Native Voices in STEM seminar series this semester is co-sponsored by IndigiFuse, HAS, the University of Arizona Sloan Indigenous Graduate Partnership, the Water Resources Research Center, the Indigenous Resilience Center, and the Office for Societal Impact. So we have lots of co-sponsors this semester. Native Voices in STEM is a seminar that highlights Native scientists, engineers, educators, leaders, and social activists. It offers students an opportunity to network with and learn about the research and careers of Native leaders in various fields around the country and indeed around the world. So today, our speaker is Dr. Ryan Emanuel. He's an associate professor in the Nicholas School of the Environment at Duke University and was formerly a professor in the College of Natural Resources at North Carolina State University. He's a hydrologist who also studies environmental justice issues facing tribal communities in North Carolina. One side of his research focuses on the status and movement of water in the environment using models, geospatial analyses, and field studies. Another side focuses on the historical and cultural importance of water and on the burdens and barriers faced by tribes and other vulnerable communities who seek to have a voice in decisions about water and watery places. Dr. Emanuel teaches courses on hydrology, environmental science, indigenous knowledges, and environmental justice. He's an enrolled member of the Lumbee tribe. And on that note, I will turn it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Cara, for the kind introduction, and thank you to the program for the generous invitation to speak to you today. I'm a hydrologist, but I'm not going to talk about work in hydrology today, or at least not directly. I'll make some peripheral references to it. So maybe think about what happens when a hydrologist begins to expand and bleed over into other areas of scholarship for reasons that I will talk about today. But I just want to say to everyone, greetings from North Carolina. I'm really excited to talk about environmental justice and indigenous rights in the eastern part of my home state. This is an important part of my work as a Lumbee scholar and scientist. And I'll just jump in by telling you a little bit about our homelands, part of which you can see on this particular slide. This is a shot of the Lumbee River, where my tribe comes from. I like to tell folks that North Carolina is Indian country. We don't typically think of it as such in other parts of the US, but it certainly is. This map shows most of the present-day tribal nations who live here or who maintain claims to ancestral territories in what is now known as North Carolina. You can see out in the western part of the state, in the Appalachian Mountains, there's the Eastern Band of Cherokee, who still occupy their traditional homelands. And then moving to the east, in parentheses here, the Catawba Nation today is based just south of the arbitrary colonial border in South Carolina. But of course, their traditional lands extend far into what is now central and central western North Carolina. Other tribal nations in the Piedmont, that's sort of the plateau at the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains, include the Saponi, Hawa Saponi, and Occaneechi Band of Saponi Nation. They all have Saponi in their name. Those are their ties to the ancestral Saponi people who occupied this part of the Southeast. And then out on the coastal plain, you can see up in the Northeast, the Meherrin, and then moving to the south, you have the Coharie, the Wakama Siouan, and finally, my community, the Lumbee. I also want to point out that the farther east you go on this map, the wetter the landscape becomes. We're moving down out of the Appalachians, off of the Piedmont, and into the coastal plain. The green shading on this map indicates wetlands, and wetlands drastically increase in prominence once you come down into the coastal plain, that area that was formerly underwater at the last sea level maximum. There are a lot of riverine floodplains, so swamp forests along major rivers, but there are also a lot of non-riparian wetlands, including shallow lakes, evergreen, shrubby peatlands, and other really interesting and lovely types of wetlands. You'll see a few photos of them throughout the talk today. So because of the prevalence of rivers, lakes, and other kinds of wetlands in the coastal plain, we're all people of water. The tribal nations who occupy this region, we all identify with very specific bodies of water and very specific kinds of water. In eastern North Carolina, most of the streams that flow through this region are slow moving. They're rich in dissolved organic matter. Natural scientists have dubbed them blackwater streams because of the coloration that they have. Bald cypress trees grow in the floodplains, and some of them are more than 2,000 years old. They're the oldest living trees in eastern North America. There's a picture of one that is not that old on the left-hand side of this slide. And then on the right-hand side of the slide, there's a view of a Christian baptism happening in the Lumbee River during the mid-20th century. People continue to change and adopt new social structures and adopt new beliefs, but their connection to the river persists. In the middle of the center panel is a drawing from the 19th century depicting the Lumbee folk hero. He was considered by others to be an outlaw, Henry Berry Lowry. He led a band of guerrillas that fought against the Confederate forces during the Civil War, and then later fought against the Reconstructionist forces, who in Robeson County, where Lumbee people are from, were the same people. They just wore different hats after the Civil War. So he was considered to be a freedom fighter and an early opponent of white supremacy in the region. So since I'm Lumbee, I also want to acknowledge that we have a long history of pursuing education. During the Jim Crow era, there was three-way racial segregation where we lived. We had to create our own schools to educate our children. And so you can see some of these historic pictures from the 1920s, 1930s, 1940s. That picture of Magnolia School in the top right is my grandmother's high school basketball team. And so my grandma is right here in the lower left-hand side of this slide. We also created a teacher training school that is now known as the University of North Carolina at Pembroke, and it's a public institution, part of the UNC system. My other grandmother, Grandma Martha, attended this teacher training college, and then she taught at segregated Indian schools from the 1950s until the early 1970s, when Robeson County finally integrated. Then she taught another 10 years and retired when I was young. She and other elders taught me to pursue as much education as possible and then use it to help our people. That might be a familiar refrain to many of you that grew up in not just Native communities, but any tight-knit community. I hear this from a lot of my students. Yes, this resonates with me. I was taught to get as much education as possible for the express purpose of coming back and helping my people. My family, my immediate family, actually moved away from our tribal territory a few years before I was born for work and for education purposes. But we still maintain close ties to our family back home and to our territory. Early on, I decided to pursue a career path in the natural sciences, and specifically in hydrology. How I actually got into hydrology is a story for another time, but I'll just say that I trained in graduate school in eddy covariance, measuring carbon dioxide and water vapor fluxes from towers. and then modeling the processes at finer scales. I became a professor in 2007 and have been exploring a range of topics in hydrologic science ever since with my students and colleagues and other collaborators. Here's just a sampling of some of the topics that I've had the privilege of working on over the year. During this time, I traveled a lot. Since you all are in Tucson, here's a picture of me at Biosphere 2 back in 2010. I went there for the express purpose of getting an early look at the construction of the Landscape Evolution Observatory, for those of you who are familiar with that particular experiment. During these years when I was working specifically in hydrology and eco-hydrology and building up a lab group and a research agenda, I also continued to build relationships with individuals in my tribal community and with neighboring tribes. Most of these were oriented around educational activities with high school students, but we also did work with tribal leaders, with community members, advocates, and organizations. This relationship building was an important part of my early professional career because it gave me an additional, I will say it gave additional context to the Western academic upbringing that I had, which was very traditional. I did my undergraduate at Duke in geology. I did my graduate work at University of Virginia, and both of those are great departments and great institutions, but I was narrowly focused on the questions of the day in the natural sciences. And I frankly wasn't encouraged to think about broader connections back to other societal issues. And so I'll say that this relationship building time in my early faculty career allowed me to see, unfortunately, the slow unraveling of relationships between people and place. And it was happening in my own homelands, which was a very emotional thing to experience. So this, what I describe as an unraveling, is really a preponderance of pollution from things like industrial livestock operations. You can see some of those on the top right under construction. Those are massive industrial facilities that are treated much like family farms when it comes to regulation and enforcement and things like this. But they're actually very different kinds of operations with different air and water quality issues associated with them. Unsustainable development associated with fossil fuels. Lumbee territory is actually a crossroads for natural gas infrastructure in the region where we live. And a lot of the rural communities host infrastructure without even having access to those particular commodities in their homes or in their churches or things like that. And so there are some photos here showing some natural gas compounds and then a construction site for a brand new natural gas transmission pipeline. And then on the top left, that is the scene in Lumberton, the main town in Robeson County, shortly after Hurricane Matthew in 2016, when more than a foot of rain fell in a very short amount of time all across our tribal territory. And because the landscape is so flat, low-lying, we ended up with terrible regional flooding. It was all over the national news, but it really wreaked havoc in terms of community cohesion, infrastructure. Schools were closed for about a month. There were no public services or utilities. It was a true disaster. And Hurricane Matthew was intensified by climate change. It was a slow-moving storm. It was a Category 1 hurricane, and its major damage, much like Hurricane Harvey that hit Houston a few years before, was in these torrential amounts of rain that fell. And then less than 2 years later, the exact same thing, well, not the exact same thing, but a similar storm crossed our region, Hurricane Florence, and dropped about 20 inches of rain in 1 or 2 days and repeated the exact same flooding and the exact same wreckage all over again. So during this same period of time, I was also invited by the North Carolina Commission of Indian Affairs, which is a a state government body that's made up of representatives from all the tribal nations in the state to come alongside as a technical advisor in the formation of an environmental justice committee. And I took that on initially as a service obligation. This was a new area for me. I wanted to put my education back into service for our tribes in the state, and so I offered to be on this committee, and we began to look at some of these issues and ways that tribes might respond to help their communities. And to help their non-human relatives as well. And so I am not sure if all of you know about environmental justice as a social movement or a policy. So just to make sure that we're all on the same page, environmental justice is certainly a social movement. It's also an area of scholarly research, and it's also an area of public policy. Environmental justice is defined by the EPA from a policy perspective as the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people in environmental decision-making. The policy in practice is designed to identify and address disproportionate impacts of federal actions on low wealth and racially marginalized communities. So while it's concerned with disparities, racial and socioeconomic disparities, environmental justice is also concerned about the power dynamics, the structural inequalities, and other factors that are at play that give rise to the disparities that we can see and measure out in the real world. And all of our federal environmental justice policy hinges on a 1994 federal executive order. So at this time, there is no federal environmental justice law. All of this policy kind of hinges on more than 25-year-old federal executive order. So this is also something that intersects with Indigenous rights in various ways. And one example is the critical study of barriers to participation in environmental decision-making that many of us saw with issues around the Dakota Access Pipeline several years ago. So yes, this was a story of disparities in where environmental risks and hazards were located. And this is because there's clear documentation that early on, the route of this pipeline was changed from running near the city of Bismarck's water supply to a more southerly route that cut through lands that were important to Lakota people, very close to the present day Standing Rock Sioux Reservation, but through many, many miles of treaty territory that has cultural significance and political importance to Lakota people, not to mention endangering their water supply. So this was definitely a story of negative environmental impacts and disparities and disproportionalities that we could go out and measure, but it's also a story of procedural barriers to participation through things like flawed tribal consultation. So you all are Arizona, and I pulled some resources from you, and I'm grateful to the Indigenous Peoples Law and Policy Program there for all of the work that you all do related to tribal sovereignty and tribal consultation. But I'm quoting directly from this program that says that true government-to-government consultation recognizes that tribes are sovereign nations who know what's best for their lands and waters and communities. But we also know that true consultation doesn't always happen. Here's a quote from the Indigenous Peoples Law and Policy Program. It says that virtually every level of government, it's either wholly failed to fulfill its consultation obligations to tribal nations, or it's been implemented in ways that are confusing or ineffective. So we really don't have a great record of meaningful engagement with tribal nations when it comes to environmental decision-making in the US. The process of tribal consultation has been widely criticized by tribes themselves, by scholars, even at the international level by the United Nations. So here's a excerpt from an end of mission statement by a special rapporteur who came to the US several years ago to look at this exact issue of whether or not the United States is engaging meaningfully with tribes on decisions around major infrastructure projects, particularly fossil fuel projects and things like this. Um, So in 2007, most of you probably know this, the United Nations adopted a Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and it asserted, among other things, the right to free, prior, informed consent from Indigenous peoples on activities that affect their lands or their territories or their communities. The U.S. initially held out. It was one of four settler colonial nations that did not sign on to the UN Declaration initially, but the U.S. initially agreed to abide by the Declaration. There are a lot of buts here, but the U.S. considered free, prior, informed consent to be aspirational. So basically, yes, we like what this is saying. We're not going to do that part. It's almost like they had their fingers crossed behind their back when they signed it. All of this background's relevant to the study of EJ issues in North Carolina's Indian country. And so one of the first topics that I worked on in my engagements with the Commission of Indian Affairs and with specific tribes was the federal government's environmental review on the Atlantic Coast Pipeline, which was a 600-mile natural gas pipeline that was intended to bring frack gas down from central Appalachian shale basins to major population centers on the East Coast. It was basically going to be a substitute for coal-fired power plants in the region. So there's a nominal argument for, yes, let's get rid of coal. Coal has a lot of problems associated with it. But a lot of the concern was around, why are we replacing coal with another fossil fuel in the year 2016, 2018, 2020, whatever year it is we're talking about this particular process. One of the first things that I worked on myself was mapping the pipeline routes. On the right-hand side of this slide, you can see this black line that sort of snakes down from West Virginia through Virginia and into North Carolina. That's the proposed pipeline route that was, I think, first shared with the public back in 2014. And one of the things I want to point out is the intersection of that pipeline route with tribal territories from the earlier map that I showed you. Now, I've left off the Virginia tribal nations, but just in North Carolina, there are 4 or 5 tribes that would have been impacted by the construction and the operation of this pipeline. On the left, you can see some photos of infrastructure and construction activities that often come along with those pipeline projects. So I also want to point out that the southern terminus of this pipeline was going to be in the Lumbee community of Prospect. That's the inset map right there. And I'll show you a photograph from Prospect here. This is a compressor station on an existing natural gas pipeline network that was placed at Prospect in the 1950s. This is back during the era of Jim Crow segregation. I just want to acknowledge that, when not only did we not have a National Environmental Policy Act, but it was standard procedure to do things without asking racially marginalized people how they felt about having something like this in their community. In the 1950s, investors planned to build this massive network of natural gas pipelines to supply gas to cities throughout eastern North Carolina. And they decided to make Prospect, the Lumbee community, a critical node in their pipeline network. And I'll just reiterate that Prospect doesn't have gas service in the community. They're just hosts to this particular infrastructure. And you can see that there are these big exhaust stacks, the sort of brownish rusty things sticking up. That's because inside that blue colored shed, there are 2 massive gas-fired engines that run 24/7 in order to keep pressure on this network of pipelines that extends throughout the eastern part of the state. Well, I came to the environmental impact statement for this project at the end of 2016, looking for critical engagement with data about Indigenous peoples and evidence of engagement with Indigenous peoples themselves. But there's actually little evidence in hundreds of pages of review documents. Instead, federal regulators actually said there's nothing to see here in terms of environmental justice. This is a quote from the executive summary of their hundreds and hundreds of pages. However, even a cursory look at the data didn't support this particular conclusion. So I looked at the data that the regulators themselves had aggregated, and I found that it was a textbook example of disproportionality. So what do I mean by that? It simply means that in this particular case, American Indians were overrepresented in the federal government's own defined impact area compared to their own reference area. And so this little circular diagram shows that the impacted areas had populations that were 13% American Indian, whereas the surrounding counties, that percentage dropped down to 6%. And at the whole state level, North Carolina, we make up just over 1% of the state's population. So that's what I mean when I say disparity and disproportionality. As an educator, I'm not just a hydrologist, I'm an educator, but that sent me on a years-long process of working with tribes and with government agencies to communicate the importance of these issues around racial disparities and how they're linked to a lack of meaningful engagement with tribes. That work involved going to community meetings, regulatory hearings, doing a lot of just silent listening, and some writing as well. So some of my early work summarized my thinking as I tried to process all of this in a short commentary in Science back in 2017. I will also add there are some complications. Most of the tribal nations involved in this particular case belong to tribes, or that most of the tribal nations don't have full federal recognition, entirely unrecognized by the federal government, or they're subject to termination era legislation like my tribe, which is partially recognized under the 1956 Lumbee Act. So my work was complicated by agencies that insisted on doing the bare legal minimum, saying that we only have to communicate with federally recognized tribes instead of following the federal government's own guidance on tribal engagement, which is more expansive, even if it's not legally binding. So this screen shows you an excerpt from a federal guidance document that actually uses my tribe as an example of why it's important to pursue meaningful engagement with tribes that don't have full federal recognition. My work was also really complicated by corporate views on environmental justice. Specifically, corporate representatives from pipeline companies tended to either misunderstand or misstate concepts around disproportionality. So this top quote comes from a transcript of a case that was heard at the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals in Richmond on this pipeline. And it's a fairly prominent attorney working for the pipeline industry who says in response to allegations that a large compressor station connected to this pipeline project had a disproportionate impact on an African-American community, told the judges that, well, if you draw your circle small enough, there's always going to be a disproportionate impact. And I'll let that simmer for a moment while the quantitative-minded folks in the audience think about the logic of that statement. We can come back to that later, but I will say it's not entirely logical statement. So I also experienced corporations that conflated environmental justice with their own notions of what's considered fair and equitable. And the important thing to note here is that those notions weren't always shared by the communities that were going to be asked to shoulder the burdens associated with those projects. So one of the critical ideas in environmental justice is that the terms of what is just and equitable have to be set by, or at least informed by, the preferences of the people that you're asking to do all of the heavy lifting. And when you don't invite them into that conversation and you just unilaterally declare that you're going to restore social justice by building a pipeline, it really raises questions about, at a minimum, your understanding of what environmental justice means. And lastly, there were attempts by companies to deliberately drown out opposing voices. And those opposing voices overwhelmingly came from racially marginalized groups, Native people, African-American people, through advertising campaigns that included social media, letters to editors of newspapers, and a series of professionally produced infographics that promoted talking points from the fossil fuel industry. And there are some excerpts below at the bottom of this slide. But despite these complications, tribal nations in North Carolina spoke back. They spoke out to assert their right to have a voice in decisions about whether or not to allow this pipeline into their communities and territories. On the left side of this slide, there's some screenshots of tribal resolutions and ordinances that were passed during this time. There were even statements of support passed by the North Carolina Commission of Indian Affairs, and even the National Congress of American Indians weighed in on this particular pipeline issue and said, hey, government agencies, you need to pay attention to the preferences of these tribes. So, I had an opportunity to serve as a technical advisor and a sounding board to tribal leaders as they developed these statements. And at times I was called on to help translate these statements to state and federal officials. They made perfectly good sense to me, but for some reason, when they landed on the desk of state agencies, there was some sort of interpretation and translation that was needed at times. But I want to say that as a result, North Carolina over the past few years has been moving toward policies on tribal engagement that actually, if they're not ideal, they're a starting point, which is good because we had nothing before. There are no formally articulated policies on engagement with the state and tribes. Tribal governments in the region are better equipped to deal with these kinds of things. They're building capacity, and we're also creating a situation in which researchers and students here in North Carolina are thinking more critically about these particular issues in their work. The point here is that even if we are trained as scientists or hydrologists, we might be called on by tribal nations to use our expertise and our skill sets in adjacent or maybe not so adjacent areas. Now, you can't and you shouldn't always say yes, but there are cases where using your judgment, you do say yes. And in some cases, good things can happen. I will say in all cases, good things can happen. In some cases, they do. My view is that universities are reservoirs of knowledge and resources, and they can and they should assist tribal nations and indigenous organizations however they should. So I want to say that this policy and academic work happened alongside community organizing and activism. One of my favorite images from this multi-year saga is this picture from Getty, I think, of protesters who gathered in front of the Supreme Court in early 2020. They represent the many different communities that were joined together to speak out against this particular project. There are Black and Indigenous communities from across Eastern North Carolina and throughout Virginia. There were grassroots organizations that focus on land rights. There were big national environmental NGOs focused on climate change and issues of equity. They were all gathered together in opposition. One of the most encouraging things is the large youth component. It's just encouraging as an educator to see so many young people who are involved in this particular movement. And I think that these times of adversity really help to build capacity when we're thinking about our people who are coming up to become leaders in their tribal communities. The pipeline was actually canceled in 2020 due to skyrocketing costs and mounting delays. The cancellation of that project cast a shadow over the future of other shale gas pipelines in the eastern US. The companies actually didn't acknowledge the role of opposition in their decision to cancel the project, but I'm thankful at least that the then US Secretary of Energy did. he issued a press release via Twitter immediately after the cancellation that directly blamed the cancellation on what he called a well-funded obstructionist environmental lobby. Note here too that the secretary injects his own ideas about what social justice looks like by referring to the pipeline as a source of lower energy costs without acknowledging the preferences of the communities or the price that they were being asked to pay. Immediately after the cancellation, I published an in-depth case study of this project with American Indian policy expert and University of Arizona alumnus, David Wilkins. So Wilkins and I constructed a detailed timeline of regulatory, legal, and other events that impacted tribal nations. And we examined 4 key barriers to tribal participation in environmental governance that you can see here. Procedural narrowing is a way of sort of boxing out tribes by constraining the scope of what they're allowed to talk about in environmental decision-making. Procedural narrowing is also the compression of the timeline for engagement into a really short amount of time. Tribal governments don't have unlimited capacity to respond at a moment's notice. They often have staff or elected officials who have day jobs and can't spend all of their time on these issues. And so that compression really impacts their ability to engage meaningfully. And engagement is a two-way street. Adherence to minimum legal standards. The obvious example there is regulatory agencies choosing only to engage with federally recognized tribes, knowing that the bulk of people impacted by this project belong to tribes that don't have full federal recognition. Power asymmetries refer mainly to the political and economic bulk of the developers behind these pipelines. They are not just some of the biggest energy companies, but some of the biggest companies, period, based in this part of the United States. And then the last issue that we talk about is colorblind planning. This is the idea that it can't be an environmental injustice if I didn't mean to impact people of color, which is not a true statement. There's no assumption of animus in environmental justice. It's all borne out in the fruits of the impact. If they disproportionately impact racially marginalized or low wealth people, that's the only proof that's required. So the paper examines environmental justice through this unique lens of tribes in Eastern North Carolina, and I would recommend it to anyone who wants a better understanding of how procedural injustice can lock Indigenous peoples out of important decision-making spaces. So a lot of my work on environmental justice and Indigenous rights is motivated by a desire to protect our ancestral waterways and our ancestral landscapes from pollution, unsustainable development, and climate change. We have to do this here because these rivers hold physical artifacts of our past, like the 700-year dugout canoe that's shown on this slide. Was repatriated to the Coharie tribe, our neighbors to the north, just a couple of years ago. But these waterways don't just hold physical artifacts, they also hold the memories of who we are as Indigenous people. They're cultural reservoirs. As Native and non-Native people learn more about key concepts in environmental justice and about Indigenous people's connections to their ancestral lands and waters, I hope they will begin to think more critically about the long-term impacts of not only fossil fuel infrastructure, but of other human activities that threaten our ability to maintain historic connections to the places that we come from and the places that we live since time immemorial. With that, I'll just say that I'm always looking for ways to promote this kind of thinking in my own work, and I'm always looking to connect with people who have similar interests. So please feel free to reach out to me about your interests, and I would love to talk about future collaborations, partnerships, grad school, postdocs, and more. My contact information is at the bottom of this slide, and I want to thank you all so much for inviting me to come today.
Thank you so much, Dr. Emanuel. I appreciate that. So we already have a question in the chat for our Q&A. So I want to thank everybody for attending and say that we do have about 10 minutes for some Q&A, and I will invite the student who put a question in the chat to unmute and ask that themselves. Yes, you should. I see your hand is raised. You should be able to unmute.
Yeah, I can to begin.
Yes, please ask your question. That was a great question.
Okay, here's one. I want to ask you next question. I want to ask you how exactly we can to integrate between protection on environmental justice and indigenous rights in North Carolina to modern development of modern infrastructures and improvement social and economic well-being and wellness. Because according to my opinion, in context of your lecture, this, according to me, most important question.
Yeah, thank you for that. That's an important question. This is something we think about and talk about a lot in our communities. With the example that I gave, that there's a consensus around the real ability of renewable energies to meet our energy needs. And so the original decision to construct that particular project was a cost-based motivation on the replacement cost of coal as an energy source. And so my tribe, the Lumbee tribe, actually has we have a booming service of low-income and subsidized housing. And so the tribe is actively involved in building new homes all across our territory. And one topic that tribal leaders have begun to discuss is, given that we own all of these rooftops and that we own all of these homes for our tribal members, why aren't we doing things like rooftop solar to power all of these homes? Because in North Carolina, you have to understand that almost all of the gas that comes into the state is being used to produce electricity. It's not a heating fuel predominantly. It's not an industrial feedstock. It's for electricity generation. So we're constantly looking for ways to generate electricity, to conserve electricity and things like this. But it's really an important question, and it comes up time and time again. Are we going to continue our reliance on fossil fuels for a number of decades to come? Are we going to make the possibly hard decisions in the short term to pivot to entirely new ways of generating energy?
Thank you. And I think we have another question, and then there's a third question in the chat. So I'll let the student ask her question out loud first.
Hi, Dr. Emanuel. This is Hannah. Hi, everyone. I'm not a science girl. I am a lawyer, so my question is a little more for the legal side, but I'm just wondering, based on your experience and your work with tribes, separate from tribal resolutions being passed and community engagement, how do you see, or what do you think the most effective way is for tribes to get a seat at that table for consultation?
Yeah, sometimes I wonder if the table is even the right metaphor, and do I actually want tribes to have a seat at the table, or do I want us to break into the room and throw the whole table out? So I'll just be honest with you and say that's how I feel a lot of times. It's a more tactful process than what I described. I think in reality, what it is relationship building. And we did a lot of that through this period that was unfortunately marked by adversity, but we came out the other side in 2020, where tribal leaders, elected officials, and elders had better relationships with people who are in positions of power in state agencies. And the leaders of those agencies finally realized that, hey, these people are more than beads and feathers, regaliaed individuals that show up at cultural events. They have identities that are tightly bound up with these specific places. And the way that we've traditionally made decisions about the environment doesn't necessarily capture their values and their preferences. And I think that just building those relationships and educating people up to the level of we're three-dimensional people and communities who do have real concerns is a major breakthrough.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. And then there was someone else on the chat who had a question. I've invited them to unmute and ask it. And then there's a question from the classroom as well.
Great. Can you hear me on this?
Yes, we can hear you. Thanks.
Okay, fantastic. Thanks so much for the talk. It's great. I can't believe it's so I just heard a story about this national effort to put valuation on natural resources across the U.S. And from my perspective, I can see some real value in being able to bring things to the table, but I can see some real dangers in who gets to set that value. And I'm wondering if there are discussions about that within the environmental justice community and what the thoughts are in the Native community.
Yeah, certainly. That is not an area where I work. I don't work on valuation of resources at all. I know that people see that as a strong tool. If we can ascribe economic value to these, whether you call them ecosystem services or resources or what have you, and people have done this successfully in the past with things like water quality, water supply provisioning and things like this. And you can show how many billions of dollars wetlands are providing in services. Those can be powerful incentives to persuade people to conserve those resources. I know there's also some skepticism because it's can be easy to game the system, right? And tweak those values to be high or low in comparison to other kinds of priorities. I don't think that it's a settled discussion, but I know that this valuation of resources is a tool that environmental justice advocates have that they can wield in these policy discussions.
Thank you. And then I believe there's a question in the classroom. And then there's
working.
I can hear you.
Yes, it's on. I think it's on.
Yeah, it is
Okay.
on.
So I was wondering if you can, I know you briefly talked about some of the shortcomings of the federal government in helping tribes. Can you specifically talk about any shortcomings that the Office of International Tribal Affairs from the EPA has made in the past couple of years, and in what ways they could correct upon that with the recent IRA funding?
Yeah, thanks for that. I actually haven't had much dealings at all in the communities that I work with EPA folks. The only engagement that we had was some folks from the Office of Environmental Justice came to an intertribal environmental justice meeting that we held in North Carolina several years ago. It was the first time that we had managed to gather leaders of every tribe in the state to talk about anything related to the environment. And we did have two representatives come down, and they pointed to some of the existing environmental justice policy that EPA works on, but there was very little other than that. The only other intersection that I have had with EPA folks in recent years is was related to a civil rights complaint, and that's another avenue that marginalized communities can pursue that is backed by federal law, but there's a higher bar for bringing a case on civil rights grounds. But unfortunately, I can't speak to other things happening with the EPA right now.
Thank you for that question. I think we have a couple more minutes, and I see that Dr. Carletta Chief put a question in the chat, and then I see that Dr. Lydia Jennings put herself on camera. So I'm gonna say, Dr. Chief, would you like to read your question aloud, or say it? Take yourself off mute.
Sure. Yes. Thank you so much, Dr. Mayo, for this outstanding presentation. I just am so grateful for your work, an example of how science can really connect to people, particularly Indigenous communities. So I really appreciate your work and honor it here in this space. My question was really about the differences between tribal leaders and tribal community members when it comes to these types of developments of proposals of pipelines. Because in your slide, you had that quote that said, actually, it's going to be providing economic benefit to the communities because of X, Y, and Z. I've seen that happen in my own community where coal mining has occurred over 50 years for electricity production with the promise that it would benefit the community, when in actuality, very little, almost to none, actually comes to the impacted community, and is really more for the greater benefit of the Navajo Nation. So that's where my question is coming from. Like, in your work, in your community, do you see any, what are the similarities and differences between the Indigenous community member versus like a tribal leader that is trying to work towards economic development for their tribal nation? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Carletta. There are a couple of things I want to respond to. The first, I'll just say, tribes are complicated entities. And I hope that I don't give the impression that there's one view, be it a Lumbee view or a Lumbee governmental view, because there's not. Just like any other, those of you from tribal communities know this, there are complicated politics, there are complicated community opinions on topics. And so with respect to this pipeline, we definitely have people in the community who said, we got to have this thing because the developer says it's going to bring economic development to our community. It's going to bring jobs and it's going to bring income to our community. I sympathize with that view, but I will say that in the 1950s, when the investor said we're going to build a natural gas pipeline network through Eastern North Carolina, they made the exact same arguments in the 1950s that the companies were making in the 2010s about the latest pipeline. You could read the news articles from the 50s where people reported on these community meetings where they would go around to the cities and pitch the idea for this pipeline. And they would say, it's going to transform the economy of Eastern North Carolina and lift all of you people out of poverty and industrialize the coastal plain. That didn't happen, or didn't happen because of these pipelines. But they made very similar promises again. And a lot of people are looking for, they're looking for solutions, and that is a solution, and they're going to hold on to that. We had elected tribal members or elected tribal officials who also embraced that. I did not share that view, and I had to be clear about my opinions and biases. And there were cases where people wanted me to work on certain initiatives that I said, I just can't do this because I don't believe personally that this is going to be a positive path forward. And so it was really hard. It was hard to say no to helping out your people, but I just had to be clear and just, make sure that I put everything on the table. The other thing that I think that's it. That's both of the issues, that tribes are such complicated entities that of course we're going to have all of these various positions embodied within one tribal community. And it's really messy and complicated.
Thank you so much for that discussion. Unfortunately, we have to end the formal seminar at this time, and I invite the Zoom attendees to stay on because Dr. Emanuel has agreed to stay on for some additional Q&A. And I see that Dr. Trotz put something in the chat, and perhaps Dr. Jennings also wanted to ask a question. So for everyone, I say thank you very much to Dr. Ryan Emanuel for speaking with us today, and to all of you for attending. I would like to acknowledge once again that we have multiple co-sponsors for Native Voices in STEM this semester: the HASS Department, IndigiFuse, the Sloan Indigenous Graduate Partnership, the Indigenous Resilience Center, the WRRC, and the Office of Societal Impact. I'd like to remind you that Native Voices in STEM will be back as part of the HASS Colloquium again next month on September 28th with Dr. Lani Tsinajini speaking on collaborative hydrology research with the Navajo Nation. So you can join us again, same bat time, same bat channel, 1 month from today. And I put a link to the Native Voices in STEM website in the chat. So thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful afternoon. And Zoom attendees, we will continue for another 10 or 15 minutes. So please continue to join us. And Maya, I don't know, are you still here? Ryan, I don't know if you saw in the chat the text from Dr. Maya Trotz. Excellent talk and discussion. I'm so happy I was able to join today. Would love to connect you with women in Guyana to share your experience as they grapple with new oil extraction and a proposed natural gas pipeline thanks to US-based multinational ExxonMobil.
Yeah, thanks for that. If there's contact information that someone could share with me, that would be excellent.
Yes, I will gladly introduce you to Dr. Trotz. She and Carletta collaborated on an NSF supplement on the co-infuse workshops that we ran a couple of summers ago. And so she was a marvelous collaborator. And is Lydia Jennings still with us? I don't want to talk if she wanted to talk.
She wrote in the chat that she's all good.
Oh, she's all good. Marvelous. Well, people do seem to be leaving, so I will invite anyone who's still on Zoom with us to go ahead and unmute yourself and ask a question if you have one. Otherwise, I might go get lunch early today. Okay, from Lauren in the chat, she says, is ACES a good organization to get involved with as a corporate environmental manager / atmospheric sciences grad student who wants to engage somewhat in my free time?
Absolutely. ACES is a fantastic organization. Dr. Chief and I are both members. Dr. Jennings is too. I'm sure that there are a number of people who are on this call who are part of ACES, especially for folks who are interested in environmental fields or already working in that field. I think that you will find a good community of folks within ACES.
Would you be at the national conference in Palm Springs?
My plan is to be at the national conference.
Oh, spectacular. Okay, Lauren says, awesome, thanks. We are, Dr. Chief and I work with Diné College to support a bridge program for post-secondary advancement in STEAM, A for agriculture. And so we're now working to get a group of about 10 Diné College students to the ACES National Conference, and it'll be their first time going. So it's really, really exciting just to be part of that energy and excitement to attend the conference and get their posters ready.
Yeah, this will be my first conference since before the pandemic, my first ACES conference since before the pandemic. So I'm really excited to get back together with the ACES community in person.
Oh, neat. Yes, safe travels to everyone. So I think we do not have any questions. I don't see anyone unmuting. I don't see anything else in the chat. So I will say a final thank you to you so much for your time today. And I'll be in touch about wrapping up on the back end.
Thanks so much. I appreciate it. Thank
Okay.
you all.
Yeah, thanks everybody. Carletta, did you want to say anything else before we disconnect?
Hello, sorry about that. I'm trying to unmute myself. Thank you so much, Ryan. That was just a wonderful talk. I really enjoyed it. Just a wonderful way to kick off our series. And thanks for sharing that article. I hadn't seen that. I love the timeline. So I'll definitely read up on it.
Yeah, well, thanks for that. And I'd be happy for any feedback that you have on that piece. I aspire to do more work in that area. I do have a book manuscript that's in review now or imminently in review. And it will talk about that in some detail and some of the other topics, industrialized agriculture, ditching and draining, and some of the other issues that we face back home. I would love to get together sometime and chat about coal mining, uranium, and all of the things that you're working on. We need to catch up.
Great. I will be at the ACES conference, so let's connect there.
Excellent. I'll see you there.
All right. On that note, I will say once again, thank you and have a great afternoon, everyone. Take care.
Thanks. Bye.
Thanks. Bye.